This is Leader Time by FedNet, your podcast source for remarks by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Republican Leader Mitch McConnell on the Senate floor during the 2024 lame duck session of the 118th Congress. Schumer discussed pending judicial nominations before tributes to departing Senators George Helmy of New Jersey and Mitt Romney of Utah. The following material is protected by copyright.
President,
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Well, Mr. President, first, today the Senate will continue doing what we've been doing all week, working to confirm as many of President Biden's well-qualified judicial nominees as possible. Yesterday, we confirmed 2 more district court judges for the Northern District of New York. Anthony Brindisi, a proud son of Utica, whom I worked with closely when he was a member of Congress, and Beth Coombe, a trailblazing prosecutor. Later this morning, we'll vote to confirm Sarah Davenport to be district court judge for the District of New Mexico. Following that, we'll vote to advance the nominations of 2 more judges, Tiffany Johnson to be the district court judge for the Northern District of Georgia, and Kelly Neary to be district court judge for the Middle District of Pennsylvania. So, of the 5 judges I filed cloture on Monday, we'll have confirmed 3 by the end of today, and we'll be very close to confirming the remaining 2. While Democrats still hold the majority, we're going to do everything we can to confirm as many judges as we can. Now, on Senator Helmy. Today, we say thank you and farewell to another member of our caucus, the junior senator from New Jersey, Senator George Helmy. Senator Helmy will resign this weekend to make way for our new colleague, Senator-elect Andy Kim, who we're all very excited to get to work with. In a very short amount of time, Senator Helmy put his name on over 30 pieces of legislation, advocated for children's mental health, stood up for the well-being of the people of New Jersey, across America, and around the world. I'd also be remiss if I didn't point out that Senator Helmy never hesitated to preside during pro forma sessions, a thankless but necessary job. Excuse me. Helmy's service will also be remembered for its historical significance. He was the first senator from the Coptic Church. Senator Helmy's faith had an immediate and direct impact here in the Senate when he invited His Grace Bishop David of the Diocese of New York and New England to the Senate a few weeks ago to deliver the first ever Senate opening prayer by a member of the Coptic Orthodox Church. So, Senator Helmy, congratulations for a job well done. You made New Jersey proud. We wish you and your family the best. Finally, today I wish to pay tribute and say thank you to a colleague from across the aisle, Senator Mitt Romney, who delivered his farewell address yesterday. I enjoyed meeting Senator Romney's family, his sons, his wife, at his reception the other night, and told him how much I respected him and how much we'll miss him in the Senate. On most issues, Senator Romney and I may have seemed like oil and water, but I've always appreciated him for his decency, his commitment to our country, and his willingness to work in good faith in a bipartisan way when the chance presented itself. And over the last 4 years, we found numerous ways to do just that. Senator Romney was a good partner with me on COVID relief legislation, despite much opposition from the other side, and he helped build consensus on the infrastructure bill. He also remains a fierce defender of the Ukrainian people. Finally, I will always appreciate that Senator Romney joined me alongside Senators Rosen, Kelly, and Cassidy on our mission to Israel in the aftermath of October 7th. So thank you, Senator Romney, and I wish you and your family a best chapter, a new chapter in your life. And finally, a few days ago, I sent Senator Thune a letter asking that we go through the regular advise and consent process. That meant full FBI investigations of every nominee, the Senate be able to look at those, hearings with questions in the Senate on every nominee, and then votes on the floor. I'm glad to see that at least the President-elect's administration is beginning to look at the FBI investigation issue, and that's a small step in the right direction. But we must have them for all nominees. They must be full FBI investigations, and they must be available for senators to look at. And of course, the necessity of hearings for each nominee, the necessity of votes on each nominee are just consonant with the advise and consent process that we have done in America for decades and decades and decades under Democratic and Republican presidents alike. I hope there will be no deviation from that grand and useful tradition. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
McConnell devoted his leader time to a tribute to his Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy. Thanks for listening to this FedNet podcast, and be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. This program is copyrighted by Federal Network, incorporated and provided for informational and educational purposes, only with all rights reserved. Unauthorized reproduction, distribution, or use of this episode without explicit permission from FedNet is prohibited. Visit us online at www.fednet.net and watch FedNet on Amazon Fire TV, Haystack News, and Local Now for coverage of the United States Congress like no one else.
The Republican leader.
Every year, scores of bright young people arrive on Capitol Hill to begin careers of public service. On the whole, they tend to be bright, ambitious, principled, and patriotic. And I've been fortunate to have the best of them on my team. But I'm certain that no one has ever shown up on day one better prepared to advocate for a state he's not from than my Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, Scott Rapp. From the moment he walked in the door in 1999, Scott knew as much about my legislative record and about Kentucky's priorities as anyone on the team. Before long, he was fluent in the Commonwealth's smallest towns and counties. Somewhere along the way, he turned into a rabid fan of Kentucky basketball. And for years, new arrivals to my staff in the Republican leader's office have consistently mistaken this honorary son of the bluegrass for a native son. I say all this to make it clear that the kind of person we're dealing with, this is the sort of friend and advisor that simply doesn't grow on trees. The natural whiz who still studies relentlessly. The wonk whose expertise runs both deep and wide. The man for whom loyalty is not a transactional currency, but a way of life. And of course, the champion of Blue Shirt Thursday, and the only member of my staff who can pull off the bow tie. This exceedingly rare breed, this is Scott Rapp. As my policy director, there's no topic that falls outside his portfolio. And there's no problem that isn't in some way his to solve. This is hardly a recent development, and it's certainly not by accident. After just a few years on my personal office staff, through steady and unassuming competence, Scott became a clearinghouse for input on important decisions. Our entire team leaned on his encyclopedic knowledge, his good judgment, and, of course, his upset picks for March Madness brackets. For much of Scott's tenure, his colleagues turned to him as a resident expert on health care policy. He had to protect my blind side on a set of issues I confess have always confounded me. But when you're as good as Scott is at boiling complex problems down to their essence, you wind up pulling extra duty. It didn't matter if an issue wasn't in his portfolio. If it was really hard and really important, it, of course, would wind up on Scott's desk. Eventually, as is often the case with the greatest flying aces, it fell to Scott to lead the whole squadron, to marshal the strengths and expertise of my entire team, and to deploy them in pursuit of an outcome. There have been very few outcomes Scott has pursued and not achieved. And that's because he's one of the very few people in Washington who, by their very involvement in an issue, signal that things are probably going to somehow work out. I'm speaking, of course, about Scott's daily arrival to light and tend the fireplace in my Chief of Staff's office. In meetings anywhere in the Capitol, Scott speaks with my authority, but a command of policy nuance and procedural requirements entirely his own. Without uttering a word, Scott patrols along the back wall of this chamber or sign to our colleagues that things are under control, or at least they will be very soon. Scott, of course, is too modest to acknowledge this. He's too self-effacing to admit the number of times where the price of rescuing must-pass legislation or keeping the federal government's lights on has been his nights, his weekends, and his all hours attention. For a husband and father with a young family, it's difficult to quantify this sacrifice. It's impossible to overstate how the road to high-stakes government funding agreements has so often been paved with missed swim meets and soccer games, and with goodnight calls and bedtime stories over FaceTime, illustrated with a Cookie Monster hand puppet. So I'm grateful to Scott's dear wife, Catherine, for her patience, and to Molly and Lauren for sharing their dad with us so often. There's simply no way to make sense of the quarter century of honorable service Scott has rendered without talking about a certain intangible devotion. You don't stick around that long for the pay. You certainly don't do it for flexible hours. But if your name is Scott Rabb, you might just do it because you love the Senate and believe in the people you work with. As it so happens, Scott's colleagues over the years have believed in him too. They say that his input was essential, that he'd be the person in my office, in my will, to take care of my kids, that he does the right thing the right way. And they're proud to call him their friend. Well, I am as well. And I'm going to miss staring down the toughest fights with Scott Rabb at my side. But if anyone is entitled to cut the net down and walk out of here satisfied they left it all on the court, it's Scott. So, Scott, Thanks for everything.
Thanks for listening to this FedNet podcast, and be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. This program is copyrighted by Federal Network, Incorporated, and provided for informational and educational purposes, only with all rights reserved. Unauthorized reproduction, distribution, or use of this episode without explicit permission from FedNet is prohibited. Visit us online at www.fednet.net and watch FedNet on Amazon Fire TV, Haystack News, and Local Now for coverage of the United States Congress like no one else.